Hello, business people around the world. I'm Robert with Knowmium, and this is another episode of Business Casual, where we're talking to interesting people in different industries to learn about them and what they're doing. Today, we're joined by Donald Wood of OneACreate. I was in graduate school with Donald a few years ago, and Donald is joining me from New Mexico. Donald, you know yourself and your company better than I do. Why don't I let you introduce yourself a little more thoroughly?
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I appreciate it. My name is Donald Wood, as Bob said, with pronouns he, him, his. So I represent OneACreate Consulting, a group that I started back in 2019, actually sort of on the side of what was a full-time job I had as a chief executive officer of a nonprofit that primarily worked in social justice education and diversity, equity, inclusion, culture change work. But it was relegated to a particular state. And so I was starting to get some opportunities outside of the state that I lived in and actually outside of the country. And so I started OneACreate Consulting. And OneACreate Consulting is essentially focused on helping organizations navigate change. I hate to sometimes say manage change, because change is happening at all times. I kind of laugh sometimes when folks say that they're going to do a change management effort or initiative, or they're going to focus in 2021 or 22 on change management. Change is happening all the time. And so it's something that, you should be thinking about front of mind at all times. And how do you adapt? How do you become an emergent organization? How do you leverage, and make the most out of change? Because whether we like it or not, change is happening. But what I found is in the work that I was doing with my full-time job and through kind of pro bono consulting I was doing with smaller, mid-sized nonprofits who a lot of times can't afford change management consultants to come in, was that complex, messy, social interactions, situations, cultures are really, 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 really difficult for folks to even contemplate, although it's like fish in the water. The fish come up to the other fish and in the water and basically say, how's the water? And the fish say, what water? Because you're just so immersed in it. It's the air that you breathe is your culture, but it's arguably the most important thing that impacts your work. And whether no matter you're putting out a service or product, whatever that work may be, as long as you've got more than one person as part of that, so two people or more interacting, you're going to have some sort of culture that is impacting that work. And so I decided that was something that I felt that I had some experience in, and had a network of colleagues that were also very experienced in that I felt that I could coordinate as part of my job. Because OneACreate is really a collective. It's really a partnership of a handful of other folks that work in the culture change facilitation world. And although we don't bill ourselves or talk about being a diversity, equity, and inclusion organization, that is a very hot and critically important, but very hot, kind of trendy topic and issue for organizations. But it really should be a way of life. It really should be more of a mindset or a lens that people apply to anything that they do within their work culture. And so that's what OneACreate tries to do, is help folks understand what that lens is in terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, because it is different lenses that come together, kind of an amalgamation that leads to being what we think is an effective culture change facilitator or culture change leader. So we kind of help them understand what that lens is, how to apply that lens, how to be responsive to different cultures and identities, because that lens has to be adaptive and emergent, but it's based in some core principles that we use in the work that we do. And everything we do is customized. We don't, proclaim that we've got a one size fits all, although our work is based in behavioral science research, best practices, years and years of doing this work of facilitating or leading or managing change. We also realize that if you've seen one culture, then you've seen one culture, because they're all very, very different, and they're made up of different people that, have unique lived experiences. They're transient in that they've got new people coming in, new people coming out. They have stakeholders at all kinds of different levels, clients, customers, vendors. So there's so much. When I say complex and messy a lot, because it is, and you've got to approach it as being complex and messy. And I always say complex, messy problems need complex, messy solutions. So ultimately, that's what what OneACreate does, is help folks co-create their own complex, messy solutions to any kind of challenges that they have, or to create the type of cultures that they want at their organizations.
Excellent. I have another friend who's in change management, and I recently asked him some questions, and I said, well, what are you really doing day to day with some of your clients? And he said, I'm not even sure at this point. And I think it does speak to what you just said. It is messy. It can be messy, especially with so many moving factors. You've got a lot of, I guess, diversity with the types of clients. You mentioned nonprofits. I know that you work with some major Fortune 100 companies. You even work with some different groups around the world. What are some of the, I guess, without naming names or company names, but where is that spectrum of types of companies you're working with?
Yeah. So I've worked with, like you mentioned, some Fortune 500 companies that are maybe headquartered, based in the US, but have offices in other parts of the country. And so I've worked with those offices. I've worked in Ukraine in 2019 through a contract with the State Department in a project that they have focused on international relations and leadership development. Did some gender equity work in Ukraine, which was very, very interesting and educational for me, as well as I hope as much for the folks that I worked with in Ukraine. And then in my life personally, I've actually lived overseas, lived in Southeast Asia for a little while in the early part of my career, and kind of worked on the side of youth development. And it's interesting because there are some core principles and best practices, I guess you could say, best practices that apply when it comes to working with organizational change, leadership development. You and I, our background from our master's program in interpersonal or organizational communications. But at the same time, going back to what I said about the importance of customization or personalization with the work, you have to approach this work and it's not just at the international level, but particularly at the international level, with a humility and a vulnerability and that lens of being culturally responsive, meaning you realize you don't know everything, very, very little. Particularly about a culture that you did not grow up in or that you haven't operated or lived in for quite a while. And if you come in as a consultant or as somebody that they've asked to come in and teach or train or facilitate or coach, that the most important thing is to do your homework and realize that, and not until you're really boots on the ground in that, and whether it's again an organization or a completely other country, that you really don't know what the opportunities are for a solution or for change. And it's always that community, that culture that knows what's best for them. So your job as a culture change, and again, I say culture, change management is a very specific field, and there are certifications in that, and I'm not as certified change management. I respect the sector a lot and glean a lot from the research and information, but I call myself a culture change facilitator, because that's really what I'm doing. I'm facilitating other people's co-creation of a solution, other people's realization of what the current reality is at their organization, where that discrepancy is between where they are and where they want to be. It's my job to facilitate that understanding, and then how to address that dissonance or address that creative tension. And in other countries that I've worked, more than it's been very humbling. But like when I went to Ukraine, the mentality and the history behind the relationship between genders, and I can't even get into the idea of non-binary or other spectrum of gender, but just strictly the traditional norm of male and female, just the difference there. And how the work that I had done in the United States, I created a program called Men as Allies to help cisgender male executives, particularly, create more inclusive, equitable, welcoming spaces for women in the workplace to address gender disparities in the workplace. And not very little of it, but a lot of it I couldn't even get to, because getting in Ukraine, just learning about the dynamic between men and women there, I wasn't even able to start talking about the workplace. It was just strictly where a woman's place is. And there was a generational difference, don't get me wrong, but for the most part, the folks that I worked with and did programs with, me talking about women in the workplace wasn't even an issue, because there weren't any women in the workplace. We needed to go even further back and even deeper back into that issue. And that was something that I was not prepared for, and learned a lot of good lessons about how, if I'm going to be doing work overseas, particularly in a different culture, that I need to be very clear to the client or whoever I'm working with that time needs to be spent ingratiating myself, learning about the goal, building trust with people, really getting to understand what are the mechanisms that have kind of led to where we are. What are the biases that are different than maybe the biases that we have in other parts of the country, and let's start from there. And that's a tough pill for folks to swallow, because a lot of people want instant gratification. They want the answer. They want a turnkey solution that they can upload the software to their computer and they can figure it all out that way. And it's when it comes to again, complex, messy culture change, there's no such thing as a turnkey solution.
Well, I'm glad you used that example of being in Ukraine and dealing with those specific issues, because I'm sure you've got hundreds or thousands of examples of whether it's a national culture, traditional culture versus a corporate culture. And it makes me think back in graduate school, I'm not even sure where, which professor this came from, but the idea was cultural communication is by far the most difficult to really master, simply because of all these different cultures. And not only all these different cultures, but then when you get to the different companies within those cultures, there's so many layers of complexities, and then you get people's personalities in there. It's just layer after layer to really navigate. And it really is, like what you said, building trust. So I definitely agree with that, those complexities you mentioned. Speaking of complexities, one of the things that has happened in the consulting world, obviously over the last 2 years, is a lot of focus on virtual. Now there's becoming a lot of focus on hybrid. How have you been using virtual communication and or hybrid formats in your work? And what do you find either satisfying or troubling about that?
I know we have a limited amount of time, so I will keep it short. But yeah, this is something, and we talked offline about this. And you've literally written the book about it, so you understand the complexity of this. The work that I did was all in person. Other than maybe a webinar that was done, the work that we do relies heavily on creating spaces where people feel psychologically safe, where they feel courageous enough to address really difficult, challenging issues. So we're not working with people to figure out where are the inefficiencies in the payroll system. We're really dealing with things that folks are bringing with them from outside of work, or things that they're not able to bring with them from outside of work, where they can be their whole selves, where they can be their best self at work, dealing with things that are going on in our world that we can't extricate ourselves from Black Lives Matter to the Pulse Orlando nightclub shooting, to the Dakota pipeline, things that, people say, oh, don't bring politics to work. You can't, that's impossible. You can't bring, that's just basically telling people to leave part of themselves at the door, which is just, people can repress those and suppress those. And so I say all that because we kind of had this crisis of how do we even stay in business, because we had to immediately, almost overnight in March of 2020, figure out how do we go to all virtual. And ultimately we did. It wasn't until July of 2020, I think we did our first, June or July, we did our first virtual workshop or training, because we do everything from workshops where we're doing training and to one-on-one coaching, mentoring, to strategic planning, to cultural assessments. All that involves being interactive with folks. So we were able to transition, and I want to say it's obvious that in person is better, but it's not for some people. I mean, for a lot of folks, this was actually an act of equity, where we were meeting people where they were, and people were more comfortable, more courageous in being themselves and sharing information, interacting with their colleagues. So to some extent, there was a significant silver lining to this work. And I think that, as you know, and your viewers, listeners know, that the pandemic, the quarantine has redefined workplace culture. And a big part of it is because realizing that some people work better hybrid. Some companies realize that they're more productive with giving that option, or being a hybrid, or being all virtual. I mean, my organization, for example, got rid of our physical office. We just realized that, we can physically meet when we need to, where we don't want to Zoom people out, or we don't want to WebEx people out, or Teams people out. But we realized that being more adaptive or emergent as we teach anyway also translates to the physical nature of the office space these days. And I think we will go back someday to having a space that's an office, but we'll never go back to the Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 kind of ideal. And we weren't really that mindset anyway. But the point is that it's affected how we do our work, but it's also affected what we teach, or what we train, or what we coach people on, and realizing that creating equity and inclusion is not just about creating the sense of belonging. It's not just about being culturally responsive. It is about physically, how people work, how people think, neurodiversity, people's interpersonal communication styles. And our professors, Bob, would be super excited that I've started to apply much more now the things that I learned in our master's program that I probably did in the first decade or so of I guess, the 19-year career now. But it's true. Now, the logistical aspects of it, we're still learning, but we've learned a lot, quite a bit. And even if the world goes back to some sort of relative normalcy, or being in person, predominantly more than virtual, I now, and my organization now, is the virtual is going to be a huge part of our suite of services, and how I do business. Personal note to everybody. I mean, I lived in Arkansas for quite a while, running an organization based in Arkansas. My family's in Arkansas, but my wife and my family and I recently moved to northern New Mexico because we can be more remote. Because of this hybrid there's no way I could have done this 2 to 3 years ago, because so much stuff was interactive. And so it also helps with quality of life. And I think overall it's going to help with people to be able to experience new experiences, because they're going to be more mobile and able to do the remote work. So it's impacted us greatly. It's something that it's evolving as we speak right now, trying to figure out how to make the most of it. I know when it comes to trying to create courageous or psychologically safe spaces for people in organizations to have really difficult conversations, to address really difficult issues, virtual is not ultimately the most ideal. I think from an accessibility standpoint, yes, you have to offer virtual for people that, for whatever reason, childcare, caregiving, other issues, health issues, they just can't physically make it. So I like now that we have this strong component of making workplaces more equitable for people. But I do think, and I think there's a physiological basis for this. I do think physically being together is going to help us optimize a culture when we're working together, on a regular basis. So I think what we just really need to do is think about how do we use the virtual aspect as a way to make sure our workplaces are equitable. How do we make sure that people can still feel like they belong and be a part of the culture and be their best selves if they need the virtual, but then how do we also not become so used to it that we isolate ourselves and we're just talking to screens, from now on, and not having that personal interaction in person. So I think that's something we have to keep front of mind as we move forward in reshaping, redefining the global workplace.
I'm interested to know, just maybe this is just from your personal observation, how do you think people being virtual and connecting with people, maybe when they can see a bit inside their homes, or seeing that they are dealing with, childcare that day, or connecting with people that are in other offices or other countries or cultures around the world, how do you feel all that has affected individuals' empathy?
That's a great question. It's interesting, and I haven't read any. I've obviously been really no longitudinal research since the pandemic about it yet, but anecdotally, I've heard or read about the idea that people it's humanizing a lot of folks because you're seeing the art in their background. You see that a pet that they have, people start to make connections. We do that in a lot of the work that I do, is that especially when we have groups of people who don't know each other that well, or going to be exploring things they don't typically explore with each other in the workplace, connecting them, finding those connections. And the virtual world has expedited that process to some extent, because someone's like, oh my gosh, I have a dog too, or I saw that in your background, that Rembrandt picture. Rembrandt's one of my favorites. I absolutely love that. And so people now suddenly make these connections that they never would have, that's why we personalize a lot of times our desk spaces, not as much to think about our loved ones because we just left the house, but to personalize ourselves and to show that we're human beings and we're not just an accountant, or we're not just a custodial engineer, we're not just a CEO. So I do think it has helped enhance that area of emotional intelligence. Empathy is a big part of the work that I do, because there are some people in the field that think you can't train or not train, but you can't develop empathy skills. I completely disagree, and I think empathy is critically important. You can't empathize with everyone. I do believe that we do have a limit into our human capacity. I think if you empathize with everybody, you would be overwhelmed and burdened and riddled with anxiety and vicarious trauma and stress and all that. But I do think now that folks literally, figuratively, literally, I guess, have a window into people's worlds that they haven't had before, and that's part of empathy building. Is what we call, we talk about a concept called windows and mirrors. And a lot of times we see mirrors in our world that reflect where we want to be, who we want to be, especially in the world of diversity and inclusion. A white cisgender male like myself, I see a lot of white cisgender males in positions where I want to be. I grew up seeing the prince in the Disney movie was a white guy. The quarterback was a white guy. The CEO was a white guy. The principal of my school was a white guy. So I see that mirror, but we need to create windows for people to be able to look through those windows and see other worlds, see other lived experiences. And so not just is the virtual world a window, into kind of finding similarities. You know, it's a mirror because you see, but it's also a window of being like, oh my gosh, my colleague who back when we were in the workplace, I used to get so frustrated with because I felt like she wasn't, you know, bringing her A game in the morning, blah, blah, blah. Well, I find out that she's not only a parent, I knew she had kids, but she's caregiving for her father also. And she has to get up 2 or 3 hours earlier than I could imagine just to make sure that the medications, there's physical, you know, things that she has to do with her father. So that, and I say that because from personal experience, I had to caregive for an in-law for a while, and it completely changed how I brought myself to work and my ability to be my whole self. And I didn't share it with very many people because I didn't feel like it was, I was comfortable enough to share. But to some extent, the virtual world has, you know, and some people don't want to share those things. I get it. And there's ways to alleviate that. But for some people, they're like, this is my life. This is my world. And I think it has created more empathy for people to realize that, hey, guess what? We aren't just workplace people and our personal. We don't just take our personal life hat off at the door when we get to the office and are immune to the world outside of it. We're not, and we shouldn't be. And so, yeah, that's a great question, and definitely something that I think has led. There's definitely been some negatives too. I think probably some, you know, things like people make us. It's natural. We make assumptions. We make judgments about people. So we may see things going on in someone's background, and so that's why the work that OneACreate does and organizations like ours is important, because you want to create cultures where people feel psychologically safe, comfortable enough to share things about their lives in order to make sure that people don't go to a stereotype. You know, these unconscious biases come up based on, you see someone's room and it's an absolute mess, and you automatically think this person doesn't have their act together. Well, no, it very well could be that they are taking care of 4 or 5 other folks, and they have a second job because they have to send money home, you know, to family maybe in another country that has some challenges, and they just don't have time to pick up their space behind them. And so we don't want to, you know, jump to those assumptions and judgments that then impact how we interact with people. I'm sorry, I'm getting on my high horse a little bit there, Bob, but yeah.
Well, no, this is well, thank you. This is why we have experts like you, because we do want to know those details. Absolutely. And I loved how you talked about creating windows to see other people's experiences. It reminds me, one of our clients, and this was before COVID, when a lot of people were in the office, they were building a regular meeting about once a month where different people from different nationalities, different cultures, different backgrounds were coming in to just share stories, talking about what was their life like before they worked for this company. Maybe they were in another country. Do they have a bunch of kids? Do they, you know, are they just whatever their experience is? And it was simply to share and to create those windows like you were talking about. And it's great to see companies who are creating that time, because it is something they're doing within their, you know, Monday through Friday job. Of course, it's volunteer for people to go. They don't have to go and share, but it wasn't where they were thinking this needs to be after hours when all the work is done. This was an integral part of what they wanted to develop in their company. And the stuff that you brought up today, it's very important, especially in this changing world, especially in this virtual world, which seems to be adding to that diversity and that empathy. So if somebody was interested, let me rephrase that. Who ideally should be contacting you and OneACreate? Who can benefit from you? And of course, we'll put your links and contact information in the video description.
I appreciate that question too. And not to sound, you know, trite. I mean, really any organization that I would say any organization that genuinely wants to optimize their service or mission, you know, because the research is definitive. I mean, the big, you know, the important research consulting groups, the Deloittes, the McKinseys, you know, for years have been putting out that a culture that is diverse, not just diverse and representative of the people that they serve, but diverse in terms of diverse ways of thinking, diverse experiences, that one that's inclusive, so people feel like they belong, that they can bring their whole selves to the space, and ones that are equitable, meaning that the groups, people have what they need in order to be their whole self. So, they have paternity and maternity leave that's sufficient. They've got things like that in place, structural things in place where they can be their whole selves, are just better at what they do, whether they're making a product or whether they are providing a service. They are just better, exponentially better. Again, the research is there to back it up. So any organization that wants to optimize their mission, but two, any organization that just wants to align their work with being a socially conscious or a organization that is giving back or supporting society and the work that they do, that we can help organizations kind of figure out, and whether you're making nails or you are a tree trimming service, that you can create a culture or provide a service that is actually giving back to humanity and support. You used to work in nonprofit, Bob, and you probably heard this. A lot of people, my wife even still says this sometimes, like, "Oh, Donald," when people ask what we do, well, Donald does the good work. He's changing the world. Just because I work in a nonprofit, he's changing the world. And she works for a huge, very important data marketing company, but she's also changing the world. But the work that she does, she helped start an LGBTQ plus ally group within her company that has transformed how some people experience their work and changed their lives. And her and other folks have done that. So, any organization that wants to create a culture where their stakeholders, so not just their employees, but all their stakeholders feel like they belong, feel like they're heard, they're respected, and not where everything's equal, but where everyone just feels that they have access or opportunities to be their best selves, to be their whole selves. If you want to create that kind of culture, we're an organization that that can help with that. And like you said, folks can reach out through our website, www.OneACreate. So that's spelled out. So OneACreate.com, and you can learn a little bit more too about what we do and how we do it. And then you can always contact me through the website.
Excellent. Well, Donald, thank you so much for joining us today, for all of these insights and just spending some time with me. It's made my my virtual communication night even brighter. So thank you. And anyone else who is listening in, if there is ever an industry or a person that you're interested in learning about or learning from, let us know, and you can contact us anytime at Knowmium. Have a great day.